Welcome to another session of Stop, Look, Listen, and Learn. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that causes a lot of candidates quite a bit of confusion, and that is Z spreads and option adjusted spreads. What I'm going to attempt to do in this video is to clarify what each of those spreads are so that if you encounter this on the exam, you won't have a problem answering those questions. So let's dive right in. Big picture, when you're talking about valuing a bond, we start off by looking at par rates of governmental bonds, and then we use the bootstrapping process to determine what the spot rates would be. And once we have the spot rates, then we take the cash flows that the bonds will produce and we discount those cash flows using the spot rate curve. So as you can see on the far right of the screen, we have the various coupons that the bond will pay over its life, and we discount each one of those coupons at the appropriate spot rate. So for example, the coupon that's being paid 1 year from now would be discounted by the 1 year spot rate. Excuse me, the coupon that will be paid 2 years from now will be discounted at the 2 year spot rate, and so on and so forth. And then once we get to the maturity, we take the coupon that's going to be paid in the final year of the bond plus the principal that will be repaid at that point, and we discount the sum of those two cash flows by the appropriate spot rate. So in this case on the board here, we would discount the coupon and the face value by the 5 year spot rate because we're assuming that this bond is a 5 year bond, right? So let's walk through an example to hopefully try and clarify the differences between the Z spread and the option adjusted spread. So let's start off by looking at a simple example. Let's say we have a bond with a face value of $1,000 and excuse me, it pays an annual coupon of 8% and it has a 5 year maturity. So based on that set of facts, the annual coupons would be $80. So each year the issuer of the bond would make an interest payment of $80 during each of those 5 years that the bond is outstanding. Then at the end of the 5th year, when the bond matures, the issuer will repay the $1,000 principal so that the cash flow in year 5 would be $1,080, right? Now, let's assume that we have determined what the spot rates will be via the bootstrapping process, and let's assume that the rates that are listed here are what the spot rates would be. So in other words, this would be the spot rate curve. If those are the spot rates, then what we would do is we would use those spot rates to discount the cash flows that this bond will produce. So for example, in year 1, the bond will pay $80 in interest, and we would discount that at the rate of 3% because that's the 1 year spot rate. And when we discount that, we get a value or present value of $77.67. In a similar fashion, we'll discount the cash flows in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we see down here what the present value of those cash flows are. And then we sum those cash flows here, and we get this number here, which would be the value of that particular bond. And once we get the value of that bond utilizing the spot rate curve, we excuse me, compare the value of that bond with the actual market price. So let's say we go to the Bloomberg terminal and we look up the current market value of that bond, and we see that the current market value of the bond is $950 and not $1,116.26. Then the question becomes, okay, did we make a mistake? Why is there such a difference between the value of the bond that we came up with utilizing the spot rate curve and what the value of the bond is in the marketplace? Well, the answer is no, we did not make a mistake. What we did is we used the spot rate curve to discount cash flows of a corporate bond or a risky bond. And the spot rates are those rates that are generated based on government bonds or risk-free bonds. So the reason there's a discrepancy between the value of the bond that is calculated utilizing the spot rate curve and the market value of the bond is because we are using essentially government rates or rates that would be applicable to risk-free bonds to value a risky bond. And as a result, the value that we get using that method is going to be more than what the value of the bond is in the marketplace. So in order to address that issue, what we need to do is, first we need to recall that there's an inverse relationship between the level of interest rates and the value of a bond. So if we are getting a value utilizing the spot rate curve that is greater than what the market value of the bond is, what that means is that we need to increase the discount rates. So for example, the 1 year spot rate of 3% needs to be increased. The 2 year spot rate of 3.5% needs to be increased, as well as the 3 year, 4 year, and 5 year spot rates. And we need to determine a set amount that, when added to each of those 5 spot rates, and then we use the revised rates to discount the cash flows, we get a value that's equal to the market price of the bond. Well, that rate that we add to each of those spot rates is what we refer to as the zero or volatility spread, or the Z spread for short. And I have calculated that utilizing the goal-seek function of Excel to come out to be 4.02%. And so what that means is that we're going to add 4.02% to each one of those spot rates, and we end up with a revised set of spot rates here. So I've dubbed that as spot rates plus the Z spread. So you can see the 1 year spot rate will increase to 7.02%. The 2 year spot rate will increase to 7.52%, and so on and so forth. And then when we utilize those revised rates to discount the cash flows of the bond, then you'll see that what we end up with is a value that is consistent with the market price of the bond. Now, and that is referred to as the Z spread, right? Now, what the Z spread is doing is it is providing us with additional compensation for the risk that we're going to take by investing in a risky bond as opposed to investing in a risk-free bond. So essentially, the Z spread is going to be compensating the bondholder for taking on credit risk or default risk and some liquidity risk. And so those are risks that you don't have when you invest in a government bond, right? So when you take on that additional risk, you need to be compensated for taking on that additional risk. And so that's what the Z spread represents. Now, the question is, we have the Z spread. What is the option adjusted spread? Well, in this case, we can assume that this is a straight bond, which has no options embedded in it. And we would use the Z spread to determine we would take the spot rate curve, and then we would determine from that what the Z spread would be, or in other words, words, that constant amount that needs to be added to each spot rate on the spot rate curve that will push the value of the bond down to the market price of the bond, right? So that's what we would do there. Now, let's look at the option adjusted spread. Let's assume that this bond here was a callable bond, for example, right? So with the callable bond, you have essentially a straight bond that has an option, a call option that is embedded in the bond. And essentially, the way to think of it is this: if you are a bond holder and you're looking at buying a bond that a corporation is issuing, so because it is a risky bond, they will have to pay you an amount over and above what the interest rate would be for a government or risk-free bond to compensate you for the credit risk and liquidity risk. And so we just covered that. But what if the issuer said, hey, bondholder, what we would also like to do is have you to agree or give us the right to call that bond away from you within our discretion. And if we decide to exercise that option or our right to call that bond away from you, you will be obligated to sell that bond to us at whatever the call price will be. And let's just assume that the call price is going to be the par value or maybe a little bit above the par value. So essentially, what will happen is the issuer of the bond would acquire from you the right to call your bond away from you whenever they decided to do that. And you would be assuming the obligation to sell that bond to them if they were to exercise that option. So what that means is that you as the bondholder, you are going to be short that option. In other words, you're going to sell the issuer that option. And because you are giving up the right to hold that bond to maturity within your discretion, you need to be compensated for giving up that right. And so the amount that you end up paying or the Z spread that you end up receiving is going to compensate you for, one, the credit and liquidity risk, and is also going to compensate you for the risk related to the option, which is that the bond can be called away from you. And what's going to happen is the issuer is going to call the bond when the rates decline, and when the rates decline, the value of the bond is going to go up, but you're not going to be able to realize that appreciation and the price or value of the bond because they're going to call it away from you at par. So that's something that can be valuable that you're giving up. So you need to get some compensation for that. And so if we look at the diagram here, so we see this line here. So this represents the spot rate curve, and you can see it tracks the rates over here. And then we have the Z spread, which we have previously computed, and that Z spread of 4.02% is added to each one of the spot rates to end up with this curve here. And what this difference is the Z spread. And so these are the rates that we would discount the bond at in order to get a value that's equal to the fair market value of the bond. And as you can see, these rates are greater than the rates out here, and that's because that bond has more risk than a risk-free bond, right? Now, if this were a straight bond, that would be the end of it. We would just have the Z spread, and we would add the Z spread to the spot rate curve and discount the bond, and we get the fair market value of the bond. But let's say that this is a callable bond. Well, in that case, this Z spread is going to compensate you for these two risks here: the credit risk, liquidity, and then the risk relating to the option. And so the way to look at it is to say, okay, I'm getting this total Z spread here, this return above the risk-free rate, but a portion of that is going to be related to the option that I am selling to the issuer, or the rights that I am giving up. So the we'll break the Z spread up into two pieces. So a portion of the Z spread would be to compensate me or the bondholder for the risk that it assumes with respect to the option that's embedded in the bond. And then the other part of the Z spread is going to be to compensate the bondholder for the credit and liquidity risk, right? And so what you want to do is, when you are comparing bonds, you might have bonds that have the same risk from a credit perspective, but one bond may have embedded in it a call option, the other bond may not have a call option embedded in it. And so what you want to be able to do to compare the bonds, both straight bonds and bonds that have embedded options in them, is you want to compute what is referred to as the option adjusted spread. And really it should be the option removed spread, because essentially what you're saying is that I am getting this much here because this bond has an option embedded in it, but if that bond did not have an option embedded in it, then this is how much I would be getting, right? And so that's what we mean by the option adjusted spread. We're trying to basically get back to what is the amount of the compensation for the credit and liquidity risk, right? Now, let me clean this up a little bit. So that's for a call option. Now, if you had a put option, think about what's going on there. So when you have a put option, the issuer is issuing the bond to you, and you say to the issuer, you know, issuer, in addition to getting the rights to receive the coupon payments and the principal at maturity, I want something more. And what I would like, in addition to those two things, is the right to put the bond to you, or the right to require you to purchase the bond in the future if I decide that I want to sell the bond. So for example, if the interest rates increase and the value of my bond starts to decline below par, well, I want the right to be able to sell that bond to you at par, even though based on the higher interest rates, the value of that bond is going to be below par. And the issuer will say, okay, well, if the rates increase and you force me to buy back your bond, so that means we're going to have to come up with the funds to purchase that bond from you in a higher interest rate environment, so our cost is going to go up. So that is something that we're going to have to get compensation for if we're going to, agree to do that. And so what the issuer would say is that, okay, if you did not get that additional benefit, then this is the amount of compensation you would get to compensate you. This is the amount of interest you would get to compensate you for the credit and liquidity risk. But because you want this additional benefit, we're going to have to be compensated for taking on that additional risk. That is the risk that you might put the bond to us. So we're going to reduce the amount of compensation we're going to pay to you. So you're actually going to get only this amount here. And so with respect to a puttable bond, the Z spread compensates the bondholder for the credit and liquidity risk. And the Z spread in the case of a puttable bond is reduced by the cost of the put option that the bondholder uh, purchases at the time that they invest or purchase the bond from the issuer. So that's in a nutshell what the option adjusted spread is. Is the option adjusted spread is that spread that you would receive if the bond that you have, say the callable bond that you have, did not have that call option embedded in it, or that puttable bond that you have did not have the put option embedded in it. So how might this show up on the exam? So obviously you're not going to have Excel or Python or any computer programs where you can compute what the option cost is and the like. So basically, let's look at this situation here. So first thing to note is that you got 4 bonds, A, B, C, and D, and we're assuming that they all have the same credit and liquidity risk, right? So bond A is a straight bond, bond B is a callable bond, bond C is a callable bond, and bond D is a puttable bond. So let's look at bond A first. So the Z spread for bond A is 222 basis points, or 2.22%. And because bond A is a straight bond, meaning that it does not have any options embedded in it, then the cost of the option is going to be 0. So that means that the option adjusted spread of the straight bond is going to be equal to the Z spread. Now let's look at bonds B and C, which are both callable bonds. So the Z spread for bond B is 402 basis points, or 4.02%. And what they will tell you is that the cost of the option, or the cost of the call option that's embedded in bond B, is 175 basis points, or 1.75%, right? And so what you have to do is determine what is the option adjusted spread for bond B. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, with respect to bond B, I'm getting a Z spread of 400 or 402 basis points, but of that 402 basis points, 175 basis points is attributable to the option that is embedded in that bond. And so if I want to get to the point to where I can do a direct comparison between bond A and bond B, I need to remove the cost of that option from bond B. And if I remove the cost of that option from bond B, I will get down to an option adjusted spread of 227 basis points. And in a similar fashion, I look at bond C, which is also a callable bond. So it has 295 basis points. That's the Z spread. So that's the total compensation I'm getting. 96 of the 295 basis points that I'm getting is attributable to the option that's embedded in the bond, and that 96 basis points is meant to compensate me for the risk that I'm assuming with respect to that call option, which is that the issuer can call the bond away from me at a time that's not advantageous from my perspective. So also I want to get down to the option adjusted spread for bond C. So I subtract or remove the option, and I get down to the option adjusted spread of 199 basis points, right? Now, finally, let's look at bond D, which is a puttable bond. So the Z spread that I am receiving, or that the bondholder will be receiving on bond D, is 165 basis points, right? Now, the 165 basis points is the amount of the Z spread, and that is the compensation that the bondholder owning bond D would receive. That is net of the cost of the option that the bondholder would have, which in this case would be a put option or the right to put the bond to the issuer. So essentially, what you would do here is you would add to the Z spread the cost associated with the put option that you have. And essentially, the way to think of it is that if you, as the bondholder, did not have that put option, and the bond D was just a straight option, then the amount of the Z spread would be 222 basis points. But because you do have that put option, the issuer says, okay, we have to get some kind of compensation for taking on the risk associated with that option. And so that compensation that we want is 55 basis points. So we're going to reduce the amount of interest or compensation we're going to give you by 55 basis points. So instead of you getting a Z spread of 220 basis points, you're going to get a Z spread of only 165 basis points. And so once you have computed the option adjusted spread for each of the four bonds, then the question would be something along the lines of, John is in the process of, building a portfolio of fixed income securities. He has these four bonds. Which bond should he acquire? And so what you want to do is you want to look to see which one has the highest option adjusted spread. And as we can see, that would be bond B. And this is the compensation that he would get for investing in bond B. Now note that bonds A, B, and C are the same in terms of credit risk and liquidity risk. So if the risk of the bond is the same, then what you want to do is maximize the compensation or the return you would get by taking on that amount of risk. And you'll maximize that by investing in bond B, because you get a return of 227 basis points above the yield for a risk-free bond. And so that's how you likely will see this on the exam. And so the key takeaway here is you want to basically understand these two equations here. So with respect to a callable bond, the option adjusted spread is going to be equal to the Z spread, which they will give you, and you're going to subtract from the Z spread the option cost. So you figure out what the spread would be if the bond did not have the call option. And in the case of a puttable bond, the option adjusted spread is going to be the Z spread, again, which they will give you. And in this case, you're going to add the cost of the option, because the issuer is going to reduce the amount of interest that is going to pay to you as compensation to it for assuming the risk associated with the put option that you will have. And one way to think of it is this. So let's say you have the value of a callable bond that's equal to the value of a straight bond minus the option cost. Now, with respect to a straight bond, you got the Z spread. And with respect to a callable bond, you got the OAS, the option adjusted spread. Now, if you were to move the cost of the option over here, and the cost of the value of the callable bond over to the right side, so what you would have here would be you'd have the value of the straight bond minus the value of the callable bond, and that would be equal to the option cost. Now, the value of the straight bond is the Z spread, and then with respect to the callable bond, you got the OAS. And so again, you see taking the Z spread, subtracting the subtracting the OAS, and that's giving you the option adjusted spread. And so that's one way to think of it. So hopefully this clears up some of the confusion with respect to option adjusted spreads and Z spreads. And just remember that the difference between the two is that the Z spread is the compensation that you're getting for assuming credit and liquidity risk over and above that which you would have if you invested in a risk-free bond. And that the option adjusted spread is the portion of the Z spread that is attributable to the risk that you are assuming or that the issuer is assuming with respect to the option that is embedded in the bond. And so hopefully that gives you a better sense of what the option adjusted spread is and the Z spread, and you're able to approach these types of questions with a lot more confidence and pick up some easy points here. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover today. So if you have any questions regarding anything that we've gone over, please feel free to leave a comment and I will get back to you. In the meantime, best of luck as you prepare for your exams, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks and have a great day.